Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of our series of 3 webinars from now until June. My name is Hassan Kazi, and I work with the innovation team at AirGrid. This webinar is meant for disseminating the outcomes of Task 2.4 of EU-SysFlex Horizon 2020 project. Before we proceed, at the bottom of your screen, there's a tab called Q&A, which you can use to send in your questions throughout the webinar. Some of these questions will be answered by the panelists at the end of the webinar, depending on the time left. However, the unanswered questions can be answered through subsequent email after the conclusion of the webinar. Okay. In today's webinar, we will address the motivation for this work, the nature of the work, how it was done, what outcomes were found, and what does it all mean, and where do we go from here. As such, the webinar is split into 4 major sections aimed at covering all of this information. We start with the introduction. The global trend of decarbonization of power systems has resulted in an evolution of power systems towards higher renewable generation levels. EU is on the decarbonization path, whereby currently around 30% of electricity demand is met by renewable generation. However, by 2030, this is meant to increase to about 50%. A key aspect of this future generation mix is that around 33% of electricity demand will be required to be met by intermittent and non-synchronous renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar by 2030. Other changes in the electricity system, such as increase in decentralized generation, electrification of heat and transport sector, and increased prevalence of communication and control technologies, presents further challenges as well as opportunities. So in view of both these factors, EU-SysFlex project is aimed at developing a roadmap for 2030 for the pan-European system, whereby renewable energy is incorporated into the system in a robust and reliable manner. Operation of the power system at very high levels of intermittent and non-synchronous renewable generation can lead to certain technical scarcities in the system due to the displacement of conventional generation by these renewable resources. The first step would be to identify these scarcities. Once identified, an overarching action plan needs to be developed, which identifies measures to mitigate these scarcities using the appropriate market and regulatory framework. It further needs to be supported by the tools required by the transmission system operators to practically deploy those mitigation measures within the system framework. Additionally, the evaluation of the capability of key enabling technologies serves as a calibrating measure. All these aspects considered together lead to a future roadmap. Various work packages of EU-SysFlex project are focused on these key areas. We will focus on work package 2. Work package 2 is centered around scarcity identification and gap analysis between now and 2030, both technical as well as financial. Within work package 2, task 2.4 is centered around potential issues that are likely to occur in 2030 on the pan-European system. Therefore, the objective of task 2.4 is to perform studies identifying technical scarcities in 2030 on the European power systems. Task 2.4 is informed from task 2.1, which based on literature survey, identified key focus areas likely to exhibit scarcities due to increasing renewable energy levels. These 6 areas are the key areas that were identified. Furthermore, different power systems in the EU zone have been evaluated by various task partners, focusing on various aspects of system stability. The Nordic power system has been evaluated for frequency stability and control by VTT. The Central European power system has been evaluated for frequency stability, steady state and dynamic voltage control rotor angle stability, and system congestion by EDF, PSEI, and NCNR, whereas the all-island system of Ireland and Northern Ireland has been evaluated for all of these aspects, including system restoration, which we're not presenting in this webinar, but it's included in the subsequent report. So in terms of methodology, the general methodology followed by various types of analysis starts with the scenarios. Scenarios reflect a vision of the system in future, reflecting a generation mix, network, and annual renewable electricity consumption levels. Various operating points called snapshots are then extracted from within the scenarios. These snapshots are used to initialize models. Various stimuli or system disturbances are used to carry out the analysis. The outcomes are then interpreted based on the study and model limits to draw conclusions. In terms of scenarios, various scenarios are considered for each of the evaluated systems. All scenarios evaluated entail greater than 50% annual renewable energy consumption levels for the respective system. The snapshot selection varied based on the type of analysis. It can vary from being every hour of the year to specific vulnerable system conditions and anything in between. So in terms of the results, we'll start with frequency, stability, and control. And the first would be EDF that have evaluated the continental system for frequency, stability, and control. And I will now give the floor to my colleague Jocelyn Fornell from EDF to take you through the work.
Thank you, Hassan. I will describe the EDF simulations on frequency, stability, and frequency stability and control analysis has been carried out for Continental Europe using the two core scenarios, energy transition and renewable ambition. Two types of time domain simulations were performed for every hour across the year. The loss of 2 gigawatts of generation in each zone and system split configurations. This is followed by an AFRR volumes assessment for each hour of the year. So if you can move, Hassan, to the following slide. The one after, please. First, the loss of 2 gigawatts of generation was simulated in 5 zones of our model Paladin. In the table are indicated the percentage of hours with extreme situations for both scenarios. The frequency nadir values seem manageable as we observe no value below 49 Hertz. However, some rock-off values above 1 Hertz per second are observed in the Iberian Peninsula up to 1.3 Hertz per second. Those values are correlated with high shares of variable renewables in the system, up to 90% of the Iberian generation. The following slide shows that the second set of simulation consists in system splits, meaning that a part of Continental Europe is separated from the rest of the system. We simulated 3 configurations with the hypothesis that the power imbalances after the split were equal to the border flows before the split, including HVDC flows. Several extreme nadir and zenith values are observed for the Iberian Peninsula and for the Italy configurations. And rock-off values are very often above 1 Hertz per second in every configuration, which could endanger the system stability. Then we present the result for the Iberian Peninsula case. On the left are given the power imbalances during the split with their corresponding probability. We call this a monotonic function, and you can see that the imbalances reach plus or minus 40% of the load for several hours for the renewable ambition scenario. On the right is the Rocoff monotonic function. They can reach very high values, up to more than 10 Hertz per second in some cases. The nadir values here on the left show a few values below 47.5 Hertz per second, which means that the load shedding as simulated is not sufficient to avoid the risk of blackouts. Finally, on the right are given the zenith values results. Here also we observe very high values, meaning that the limited frequency sensitivity mode for other frequencies as modeled is not sufficient. And you would find more details on these simulations in the paper given at the bottom. The last subject that was included in the EDF study is the AFRR volumes for the future. The increasing penetration of variable renewables leads to an increase of the short-term uncertainty, and therefore the average and extreme AFRR volumes will increase for a given level of risk taken by the TSO. And you will also find more results in the paper given below. The key outcomes of our work are the following. For interconnected incidents, on the next slide, please. Hassan. So for interconnected incidents, we observed that nadir values were manageable because we observed no value below 49 Hertz per second, 49 Hertz, which is the first load shedding threshold. However, we had some concerns about the Rocoff values, which could, in many cases, be more than 1 Hertz per second. For system splits, we observed that classical frequency control mechanisms were not sufficient, and even load shedding and LFSMO, as modeled in the study, were not always sufficient to avoid blackout situations. And finally, the transition to higher penetration of VRES results in a higher requirement for AFRR, and the annual variability also increases. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So subsequent to the continental system, this analysis was also done for the all-island power system of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we can go through what was done. Frequency stability and control analysis was carried out for the all-island power system using 2 scenarios. 2 types of analysis was carried out. One was economic dispatch analysis, followed by time domain simulations. The analysis aims at investigating an inertia scarcity through least cost dispatching analysis using rate of change of frequency, or Rocoff, as an index. This is followed by reserve adequacy analysis based on time domain simulations, whereby both speed and magnitude of reserve provision is evaluated using frequency nadirs and zeniths as indices. For the least cost dispatching analysis, different types of least cost dispatching were run for all scenarios. One type was a market run with energy only constraints. The other type was called enhanced operation constraint, and it entailed a number of reserve and security constraints. The energy only dispatch, called market run, showed excessively high Rocoff levels, as can be seen in the figure below. In the Ireland and Northern Ireland system, 1 Hertz per second is the highest tolerable Rocoff level, which is likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future. So to mitigate against this scarcity, a Rocoff constraint was introduced in the unit commitment, which uses the dimensioning event and system rotational energy to calculate and also limit the Rocoff values. It can be seen in the figure that the effect of the constraint ends up limiting the rate of change of frequency to 1 Hertz per second. For time domain simulations, for the low carbon living scenario, which is the more aggressive of the constrained considered scenarios, no significant scarcity was found. Counterintuitively, with increased renewable penetration at the bottom, going from left to right, the frequency nadirs appear to improve. This happens because increasing renewables displace the discrete large units, which make up the dimensioning event. Furthermore, fast dynamic reserves with a response time of hundreds of milliseconds, mainly batteries and HVDC interconnection, significantly impact the frequency nadirs, as can be seen in this figure. It is to be noted that the fast frequency reserve product currently deployed on the all-island system is modeled in these simulations, and it provides a significant amount of fast dynamic reserve. The steady state, the steady evolution scenario, characterized by lower renewable levels and smaller amounts of faster reserve magnitude, was also analyzed. Steady evolution scenario performs worse than the low carbon living scenario due to a decrease in fast dynamic reserve magnitude, as can be seen in the figure here. So the key outcomes for our analysis was that an inertia scarcity in 2030 on the all-island system has clearly been demonstrated and mitigated. High renewable energy scenario evaluated shows adequate frequency security. Fast dynamic reserves are found to be critical for system stability, and fast reserve products help enormously. Please note that EirGrid's current FFR product was assumed to be available. The steady evolution scenario shows that there is need for revision of scheduling practices going forward, catering for the changes in the reserve portfolio and reducing inertia levels. So I will now invite my colleague Jussi from VTT to present his analysis on the Nordic system in terms of frequency stability and control.
Thank you, Hassan. Can you take the next slide? Okay, so for the Nordic system, we analyzed 3 different scenarios: the energy transition and renewable ambition scenarios of SysFlex, and then 1 sensitivity scenario, especially for the Nordic countries, which basically is the same as energy transition, but with more realistic capacity of solar PV. And this analysis was run as a time and domain simulation for every hour across the year. Next slide. A little bit about the way that this simulation was done. We first run the dispatch model for the full year. As a result, we get, of course, the dispatch solution, and then also reserve allocation of frequency containment reserves to different plant types. And then we take a certain defined dimensioning incident, which in this case has been defined as 1400 megawatts, which is based on the largest generating units and HVDC connections for the Nordic region. And as indicators of the simulation, we use first of all frequency nadir and also the frequency rate of change. Okay, and then we go to results. Here you can see the results of frequency nadir for these 3 different scenarios. For the Nordic system, the limit for the minimum frequency nadir has been set as 49.0 Hertz. And as you can see, it was not reached in any of these cases, but the margin is quite small, especially in high solar and renewable ambition scenarios. Somebody might also be interested in inertial levels, and can say that in these scenarios, yeah, there's no separate picture about that, but I can say that they were somewhat lower than today, so around 100 megawatt seconds, gigawatt seconds whereas in the current system, the minimum is about 120. Okay, next slide. For the rate of change of frequency, we can see that no special problems are visible. The rate of change of frequency remains quite low. And also there are not very much changes between the scenarios. Maybe we can say that in the renewable ambition scenario, there were situations where the rate of change was very low because there were some very high generation situations, and then again, in some cases, the rate of change was a bit higher. But overall, there are not many changes, many differences between the scenarios. Okay, next. Then in the beginning of this month, there is a new reserve type adopted in the Nordic countries. This is the fast frequency reserve, which is especially meant for low inertia situations. And the effect of this new type of reserve was also considered in this analysis. And in the picture, you can see two cases. These are both for the high solar scenario. So we can see that with fast frequency reserve, the minimum frequency nadir increases about 50 millihertz if it's on the level of 200 megawatts. So this is also one way to fight against the low frequency nadir. Okay, thank you. That concludes my part.
Thank you, Jussi. Moving on to the next category of system stability that was analyzed, which was steady state voltage control. This was done for Continental Europe and Ireland and Northern Ireland system. And I'll now invite my colleague Matthias from PSEI to talk about the work done under this head for Continental Europe.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hassan, for introducing me. On behalf of PSE, I would like to present you the key results and conclusions regarding the analysis of the power system model in Central Europe. Regarding steady state voltage control analysis, 4 types of calculations have been carried out, including load flow, PV and QV analysis, focus on identifying a steady state reactive power scarcity, and short circuit analysis, focused on system strength. Steady state voltage control has been analyzed for 3 capacity scenarios, which have been considered both in the voltage and transient stability studies for Central Europe power system model. First scenario is the core EU-SysFlex energy transition. Going green assumes more installed renewable capacity in Poland, mainly connected to the extra high and high voltage grid. Another scenario, distributed renewables, assumes that some renewables in Poland are moved to the radial distribution systems. The operational snapshots on national level have been found using EDF continental model and consider following 3 criteria: maximum load, minimum inertia, and minimum reactive power margins for the synchronous generation. All these parameters have been provided at national level for the following sets of countries. For all of the analysis presented within the scope of PSC work, all network contingencies and fault events have been assumed in Polish power system, owing the detailed representation of power grid used for Poland. Moving on to the load flow analysis results, preliminary analysis has demonstrated absence of any issues relevant to steady-state voltage regulation for transmission network. Therefore, our analysis has been mostly focused on 110 distribution network in Poland. We have observed that problems of low voltage levels occur particularly in maximum load operational conditions. The impact of reduced voltage regulation due to the higher renewable generation becomes apparent strictly at high load conditions. In general, the reactive power demand, both from load and the network sides, determine whether voltage problem may occur in the power network. Over voltage deviation analysis show a similar trend to the observation made from the previous slide. As you can observe from the figures, there is a significant correlation between the problems with high voltage and higher level of renewables, especially for the going green and distributed renewables scenarios. Minimum inertia and minimum reactive snapshots show increased over voltage deviations, although this issue is observed across all snapshots and all scenarios. Again, the key factor affecting steady-state voltage issues is the power demand. Due to the fact that minimum inertia and minimum reactive snapshots are much closer to the minimum load operation conditions, more over voltage problems can be observed for their operational scenarios. In addition to the quantitative analysis of voltage issue, the spatial dispersion of problematic 110 kV nodes has also been analyzed. Higher renewable levels causes not only changes in the number and the magnitude of voltage deviation, but also shifts the problems from one location to another. In addition, increasing renewables penetration also impacts upon the magnitude of voltage values without causing significant changes in spatial distribution, especially for distributed renewables capacity scenario. Voltage stability margins in Polish part of Central European system have been assessed with the use of power voltage PV curve method. Relatively high correlation between voltage stability margin and load level occur in the energy transition and going green scenarios. A secondary factor having impact to the increase in voltage stability margin is the renewables generation, which change the load in the power network elements. We have also performed another analysis in order to assess the voltage stability margins in the 5 districts of the regional TSO control centers called ODMs. In general, districts having more remote generation like control center number 5, presented with green curve, are characterized by lower voltage stability margins. QV curves, which represent the relationship between the reactive power injected into power network node and the node voltage level, they showed us a general conclusion that scenarios characterized by high renewables capacity entails a higher risk of nodal voltage instability problems. Summarizing regarding final conclusions, HV grid in Poland exhibits a scarcity of steady-state voltage reactive power capacity. Reactive power scarcity becomes most apparent at high load and minimum synchronous generation conditions. Generally, higher level of renewables incorporated result in a lack of steady-state reactive power. PV analysis across various zones of Polish power system demonstrated that regions with higher magnitude of installed renewables shows a trend toward diminishing stability margins. QV analysis performed on the whole Polish power system demonstrated that scenarios characterized by high renewables capacity exhibit a higher risk of local nodal voltage instability. So thank you for your attention, and I'm giving the screen for another presenter now.
Thank you, Matthias. The steady state voltage control has also been analyzed for the Ireland and Northern Ireland power system. That analysis has been done for 2 scenarios, as is all analysis. 3 types of analysis have been carried out, with load flow analysis and QV analysis focused on identifying a potential steady state reactive power scarcity, and a short circuit analysis focused on system strength or dynamic reactive injection scarcity. The analysis has been carried out across every hour of the year, both for N-1 and intact system conditions. So for identifying the steady state reactive power scarcity, steady state voltage deviations have been used as an index. It can be seen in the figure below that as the penetration of renewable generation increases, represented by SNSP, which is the system non-synchronous penetration, essentially a measure of what percentage of the system load is being met by renewable generation. As the SNSP increases from left to right, higher deviations of steady state voltage become apparent. This occurs due to the displacement of conventional generation by the renewable generation sources. For the scenario with higher renewable generation, which is the low carbon living scenario, as you can see, there's a greater concentration of voltage deviations at high renewable penetration levels, indicating a higher steady state reactive power scarcity appearing in 2030 in the all island power system. The steady state reactive power scarcity is further evaluated using QV analysis. The evaluation index is the megawars required to attain a predefined voltage, which was set as 1 per unit. We can see in the figure below that for a 110 kV bus in the system, there's a very clear trend of increased megawatt requirements at higher renewable generation levels. This is consistent with the analysis shown previously for steady state voltage deviations. The short circuit analysis has been evaluated using short circuit power or MVA level as an index. The results have been presented for a selected strong and a weak bus in the system. For a weak bus, it can be seen that as the renewable generation level starts to increase initially, the fault levels tend to rise. This occurs because renewable generation appears in remote parts of the network, while significant enough levels of conventional generation are not yet displaced. But moving further from left to right, as the renewable generation increases further, there's a clear trend of reducing fault levels. For a weak bus, between 20 to 60% renewable penetration, if you see at the bottom, the trend is not as clear. This occurs because the bus, which is being considered, is in the proximity of a conventional unit. If the unit is dispatched, the fault level increases and vice versa. However, we can see a very clear clustering of fault level appearing at the bottom right corner of the screen at high renewable generation levels, whereby the conventional unit in question is less likely to be dispatched, and hence a scarcity can be seen to be appearing. The key outcomes for our analysis on steady state voltage are that the results of QV analysis and steady state voltage deviation analysis indicated a clear trend of increased renewable generation causing a reduced steady state reactive capacity. A steady state reactive capacity scarcity is therefore identified. The system short circuit levels are also significantly reduced as renewable generation increases. This may have implications for system protection as well as the transient stability. Weaker and renewable energy dominant parts of this network need consideration. This can be done in a number of ways, possibly through a reactive, steady state reactive power product as well. So we now move on to the next category of system stability. This has been analyzed for continental system by PSEI and April and Sony for the all-island system. So I'll now hand over the control back to Matthias to take us through the dynamic voltage control for PSEI, for a continental system analyzed by PSEI.
Thank you, Hassan. For the purposes of dynamic voltage control analysis, we have applied the same approach as for the steady state voltage control. We have also analyzed three capacity scenarios. Low voltage fault right through curves have been analyzed based on the time domain simulations performed alongside the transient rotor angle stability analysis. The analysis also has been carried out for the selected time snapshots. Voltage waveforms obtained from the RMS simulation have been compared with the low voltage fault right through profiles required by the RFG, requirements for generators network code. We have applied sets of disturbances, assuming self-clearing closed three-phase short circuit events, both for analyzing synchronous generation modules and non-synchronous power park modules like wind farms, in order to assess how outages may influence the fault right through capability of non-synchronous generation. We have also applied critical contingencies which have been identified in the voltage control analysis to the pre-fault power system operational state. As a result of the analysis, no voltage fault right through requirement violations have been observed. The FRT response curves for both synchronous generation and non-synchronous generation units within maximum load operational snapshot tend to have less oscillation than for minimum inertia and minimum reactive ones, as you can observe in the presented figures. For power park modules, there have been no significant impact observed of different operational cases to fault right through responses. Following differences between fault right through plots representing maximum loads and other operational snapshots can be explained by greater power stiffness for the maximum load conditions related to lower synchronous to non-synchronous penetration level values and higher synchronous generation level. Summarizing regarding final conclusions. No low voltage fault right through requirement violations have been observed in our transient simulations. The fault right through response curves for synchronous generation and power park modules tend to have less oscillation within maximum load operational snapshots than for minimum inertia and minimum reactive power system operation condition. Following differences can be explained by greater power stiffness related to lower SNSP values. Although, due to the character of fault events applied in the simulation and also pre-fault power system operation state, a clear indication of a lack of dynamic reactive injection capacity in Polish power system is not apparent. Therefore, an absence of dynamic reactive power scarcity cannot be easily concluded and requires further investigation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm giving back the control to Hassan.
Thank you, Matthias. So the dynamic voltage control has also been analyzed for the all-island power system, and I'll invite my colleague Peter Wall to take us through the work done for dynamic voltage control for the all-island system.
All right, thank you, Hassan. So good morning, I'm Peter Wall. I'm a Senior Innovation Engineer at Airgrid. And as Hassan said, I'm going to talk you through the work we did on the dynamic voltage control scarcity with Airgrid and Sony. So next slide, Hassan. So first things first, we have two scenarios, low carbon living and steady evolution, where low carbon living is the more ambitious scenario with high renewable penetrations. We assessed 800 short circuit fault contingencies. We're using time domain studies, and because each scenario had 8,760 hours of operation, because they reflect the full year, to keep things a bit more manageable, we decided to select snapshots for each scenario and just study those snapshots for all of the contingencies. So we had about 40 snapshots for each scenario, and then studied every contingency for every snapshot. For today, I'm going to focus on the LCL results as that had the highest renewable penetration and probably is of the most interest to everyone. So slide, please. So here you have a 3D plot of all the hours of operation that came out of that Plexus production cost model. They're scattered with three metrics, S and SP, which, as Hassan mentioned earlier, is the penetration level of converter interface generation into the system. You then have rotational energy or inertia on one axis and the number of large units near the load centres in Northern Ireland and Dublin. We felt these were three good measures for breaking out each snapshot and then splitting them into types. We defined high and low in terms of each of the three measures, and then each type was effectively high or low in one of those measures. So you had 3 measures, 2 states, 8 types. I'm going to call out 2 types there, type 1 and type 2 as we called them, because they're probably the most extreme types and the most interesting for some of this analysis. Type 1 is the high inertia, lots of units in the load centres and low S and SP. So your sort of classic operation. And type 2 is very high S and SP, almost no units near the load centres and very low inertia. So they're going to be the focus today. And then if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about how does the scarcity of dynamic voltage control manifest from our perspective. I think the key thing is you have larger voltage drops that propagate further across the system. And this can be a localized scarcity or a global scarcity, where that's all about the number of contingencies that generate this problematic voltage drop or the spread itself of the voltage drop. I think one thing to bear in mind is that if you have a lot of localized problems, you have to start thinking of it as a global problem, or you're going to find suboptimal solutions. You have a patchwork quilt of local answers to what really was a global problem. So just the next slide there. So how do we then measure that scarcity that we have? We use 2 measures looking at that voltage drop, the number of unique violations, and that's how many buses went below 0.5 per unit for a contingency. And then secondly, the early recovery, which was which percentage of those buses that went below 0.5 were recovered to above 0.5. So that's trying to capture the initial drop and then the recovery while the fault is still on. Both those measures are during the fault on period before it's been cleared. So the results for the first unique violations are on the next slide. And this is a bit of a busy slide, so I'm going to take a moment on it. There are box plots on that axis. Each box plot relates to one snapshot, and the unique violations for every contingency are captured within that box plot. So as you can see, where I've marked global scarcity in that red box, that's type 2 with a very high S and SP. That has a global scarcity. The boxes are all high, which means you have a really wide fault propagation. Bear in mind the peak there is about 1300, and our model has about 1300 buses. So what that means is when you had that contingency, the entire network immediately saw it and dropped in voltage, which is pretty worrying when you think about it. And then when we look at type 1, which is our low S and SP, you see there's not much of a scarcity at all in that blue box. Things are quite happy. And then you get to the slightly more interesting, the medium S and SP, the other types, which tells us that while S and SP is great at telling us the extremes, it doesn't tell the whole story. There is a localized scarcity there that isn't necessarily driven by S and SP. So we have a global scarcity, I'd say, for that type 2. And if we move to the next slide, we'll talk about the early recovery, which adds another level of interest to this. We can immediately see that as you have higher S and SP, you have more early recovery, which gives you that vision of a voltage that drops deeply, then quickly bounces back, which if we progress to the next slide, we will see what that really looks like in terms of a voltage profile. So what I've shown here is you have one contingency that was applied to type 1 and type 2 hour, and these are the results. You can see the type 1 has a pretty classic, the voltage drops and just sits, and then when the fault clears, it recovers. Type 2 has this rather more chaotic. It drops deep, as we'd expect from the unique violation results, but then the reactive power injection from converters during the fault drives it back up, which means when the fault clears, it's actually got a very similar voltage profile to type 1. But then after the fault clears, that same injection, which helped the voltage recover during the fault, gives us those worrying swings. So from this, for me, you get 2 clear questions. The first, most worrying, is would the system really survive those swings? And that's when you start cutting into the modeling limitations of some of these studies. We've shown that there's a clear global scarcity with that dynamic voltage control because you get a deep, wide drop. We can see that converter impact can help that recover. But the impact of that, we're not modeling the PLL instability, converters tripping on voltage and things, which means whilst we've captured the scarcity, we may not actually be fully telling you how severe the impact of that scarcity will be. So things could be worse than these studies indicate. And we should bear that in mind when looking at the later study results for rotor angle, that this voltage issue really sort of colors some of those results. After nailing down those model details, you have to think about the fact that how long a delay in that fault on recovery could I tolerate? You start, for me, then linking to a sort of FFR type conversation, but for reactive power. I don't necessarily need the instant limitation if I get very fast, controlled, dynamic reactive response that helps manage my profile, provided that fast response then doesn't give me those post-fault oscillations. So next slide, if you would, Hassan. Building on that sort of future work idea, I'm going to summarize our conclusions. And the first of those, as I mentioned earlier, we have a clear global scarcity dynamic voltage control. We will have widespread issues at very high SNSP, and even at lower SNSP, we will have localized issues emerging, where certain contingencies always present a problem, and certain conditions will always have a problem for all contingencies. So there's a real problem coming down the line in terms of this dynamic voltage control scarcity, and we've got to find some answers. The scarcity is very driven by the location of synchronous machines, is what we found, and this was true in both LCL that I've spoken through there and the less ambitious steady evolution scenario. And what it basically emerges is that you have regions of the system where you have very few synchronous machines or even no synchronous machines. And as they are currently our primary source of dynamic voltage control, those regions effectively get abandoned. And as you increase SNSP, the likelihood of those regions increases. And going back again, you've got to make sure that while some people talk about the fact that reactive power is a local problem and should have local solutions, I think when you start seeing this number and spread of local problems, you've got to address it as a global problem. You can't just have a patchwork array of local solutions, each of which will be inefficient, increase the risk of stranded assets, and the risk for anyone who invests in providing these services. And I think just finally, before I pass you over to Matthias, I would say that SNSP is a great measure for getting the extremes. But when you really want to cut into the detail of this, we need to start developing more detailed measures to understand where the problems will emerge and where we'll need the solutions, as well as working on those modeling issues that I mentioned, where we need to keep increasing the complexity of our models to reflect the complexity of operation. So thanks for your time, and I'll pass you to Matthias to go over PSEI's work on rotor angle stability. Thank you.
Thank you. So for the purposes of rotor angle stability studies for the Continental European power system model, we have applied the same three capacity scenarios as for the steady state and dynamic voltage control. We have also performed dynamic time domain simulations representing electromechanical phenomena in the system. The analysis has also been carried out for selected snapshots. Critical clearing times, which have been calculated, are described as the longest clearing times for which power system will remain in synchronism. They have been calculated for a presented set of assumed network fault events. Presented disturbances at normal clearing fault time have been investigated. Selected disturbances have been applied on the transmission lines and busbar in the Polish transmission network substations, which transfer power from the biggest conventional Polish power plants. For each of the presented disturbance events analyzed, required values of critical clearing times and transient stability margins have been met with sufficient excess. For each of the analyzed scenarios, median values of critical clearing time tend to be the highest for the maximum load operational snapshots. The larger the active power demand is, the larger the number of synchronous generators operating is, which leads to the increase of the inertia level in the power system. An increase in the level of inertia augments the power system transient stability margin. Generally, minimum reactive and minimum inertia operational conditions, simulation results tend to be comparable, but lower than corresponding values for the maximum load. The lower the reactive power generation is, the lower the voltages of generators are, which causes the decrease of transient stability margin for those generators. The overall power system's inertia is being reduced for the minimum inertia and minimum reactive operational cases due to higher renewables penetration. So there's a indirect correlation between those measures. For the purposes of oscillatory stability analysis, settling and halving times have been calculated in order to assess the damping of inter-area and inter-plant oscillations. Those regulation time indices, which an definition has been presented on the following figure, can be calculated as a time after which the observed rotor angle signal does not extend beyond assumed control band. The width of the reference control band is defined as a percent of the first amplitude value, which are 15% for settling time and 50% for halving time. High penetration of renewables and decrease of synchronous generation cause significant issues with an oscillation damping. For each of the analyzed capacity scenarios, both halving and settling time median values tend to be the lowest for the maximum load operational snapshots. The lower the settling and halving time is, the better. The larger the active power demand is, also the bigger number of synchronous generators being operating in the power system is, which indirectly leads to the increase of the inertial level in the power system, which leads to augmentation of the oscillation damping in the power system. Overall, the overall power system's inertia is being reduced for the minimum inertia and minimum reactive scenarios due to the higher renewables penetration instead of synchronous generation, as you can see in the presented figures showing rotor angle plots for various operational snapshots, sample ones. The lower the reactive power generation in the system is, the lower the local voltage of generators connected at the power plants are, which causes reduced oscillation damping in the system. In general, high penetration of synchronous generation due to the higher active power demand helps system to better damp power system oscillations. Finally, bringing rotor angle stability analysis to the final conclusions. Our analysis of critical clearing time showed no emergence of localized scarcity in stability margin when assessed in terms of expected primary protection operation time for assumed events. Also, we have observed no evident trend in transient stability margins in the function of capacity scenarios. Performed analyses have shown that local conditions of synchronous generator, like generator operation point, the nearest network topology and configuration, and also other synchronous units committed in the vicinity, determine the synchronous torque and also the mechanical torque, which indirectly or directly affects the transient stability margin. Although this issue and relation between synchronous torque and mechanical torque in function of local and global condition of a system is more complex and require further investigation. Regarding oscillation damping analysis, following conclusions can be drawn. Oscillation damping presents a global scarcity with poor settling and halving times for all cases and scenarios. Time domain simulation have identified the poor oscillation damping during severe system disturbances, with only maximum load cases having any significant number of acceptable settling and halving times. So, thank you for the attention.
Okay.
Give away the floor once again to Peter to speak through the rotor angle stability.
Thanks, Sam. So, hi again, folks. I'm now going to take you through Egrid and Sony's work on rotor angle stability. which mirrors PSEIs. And if you check the next slide there, Hassan. So as for the voltage control work, we have the same scenarios, the same 800 contingencies, and the same snapshots. So we have nice consistency across the two studies. Again, I'll be focusing on the more ambitious low carbon living scenario. And if we just go to the next slide, we'll see again that scatter of points. I'm going to touch on this again briefly, remind you all, you've got the type 1, which is your high inertia, type 2, which is your high SNSP. Then have the types in between, which are, in many ways, are shoulder cases. And I just want to raise one point on these about how they can create that mixed localized issue, in that you have to bear in mind when you're in the sort of the 60% SNSP to 80%, so the high mediums, there's a whole variety of different ways you can reach that SNSP. We had a lot of fascinating cases. We had a few large sets and lots of wind. Equally had cases with lots of smaller generators and some wind. So you need to remember that there are what I think of as flavors. There are lots of different flavors that you can get to that SNSP, and there won't always be that like for like, whereas at the extremes you have all synchronous, practically all wind. So if we just move on to the next slide, and again, how does the scarcity manifest? Well, how does the rotor angle issue really come at us? It's a scarcity of synchronizing torque or damping torque, which is pretty much talking about the loss of synchronism of units through that sort of just non-oscillatory drift away as they slip a pole, or those big angular swings where the system pulls itself apart. This can be localized, so you can have one generator that just slips a pole on a fault or oscillates by itself, or it can be global, where you have larger groups oscillating or separating, which can drive that system separation. So we have a slightly different flavor of severity here, where the global problem in terms of rotor angle is a real threat to system integrity. If you have system separation, a lot of systems aren't going to survive that. But again, you have the fact that you have lots of small localized problems, they can build up to a global problem. So how then did we measure this? We had 3 metrics this time. Angle margin, which is really a measure of the angular spread across the system. Critical clearing time, which I'm sure as you all know is how long can you wait to clear a fault. And decay time, which is how long does it take an oscillation to decay down. I'm going to take you through each of those in turn, starting with the angle margin on the next slide. So here you see angle margin. We've got the equation there of how it's calculated. I won't reiterate that to you, but you basically have a number that ranges from 100 to minus 100. And 100 means there's basically no angular spread in the system. And less than 0 means the system's unstable. That a generator in that system has slipped a pole. You immediately see from these results, you have that nice green line at 0 that breaks it. Practically all our points are stable, but we do have that localized instability emerging for that medium SNSP case where one unit, as you can see in the time domain plot, has experienced a non-oscillatory loss of synchronism. The fault came on and it just drifted off the system. I won't delve into the full details of that, but it's the loss of stability of that unit is quite a complex beast, to be quite honest. We did some studies and found that adding 1 pico unit close to it resolved the instability. And that's something I think it's important to touch on. When you have so few synchronous units on the system at these higher SNSPs, it's not just about how many of them do I have, it's really about where I have them. So again, it's drilling into that, staying away from system measures and looking at that more detailed analysis. But in terms of angle margin, we have a localized instability, but no real global problem. Going on to the next slide, which covers critical clearing time. This we found using a binary search. So the red line marks the 8 cycle clearing time, which is our sort of expected clear time. The green line is our worst case backup clear time at 25 cycles. And any clearing time of more than 70 cycles doesn't appear in these box plots. So unlike the other box plots that had all 800 contingencies, this just has the subset of, shall we say, problematic critical clearing times. And you can see we have a localized issue for backup protection. A lot of those boxes are starting to creep down below that green line, and some of them are starting to get a little too close to that red line with their tails. But equally, as you can see on the slide, 76% of the cases have above 70 cycle clear times, so they're absolutely fine. So again, we have a localized issue that isn't necessarily strongly linked to SNSP. Going on to the next slide, where we'll talk about decay time constant. This, again, you can see got the green line, which is our 7-second requirement, and there's that localized issue, and it's very volatile with SNSP. Both critical clearing time and decay time constant can be captured in the variation with SNSP by the fact that both issues are driven, usually by an individual unit going unstable or or oscillating in the case of the all-out system. So if you look at the left-hand green type 2 case, which has very low decay time constants, that does not have a decay time issue because none of the oscillatory units are on. So it's not just about assessing how much damping do I have, it's the comparison of how much damping do I have against how much damping do I need. So in that type 2 case with low decay times, the oscillatory units weren't on, so it didn't need much damping. It has quite low damping, but there's not a lot to damp. Whereas the type 1s where you have higher damping, you have units that will oscillate on, and therefore you have a higher damping requirement. Equally with critical clearing time, if the units that are vulnerable to the fault and are isolated aren't on, you won't see the same critical clearing time problem. So moving on, I'm going to try and summarize on the next slide our conclusions from this. As you can see from all the results, we have a localized scarcity of rotor angle emerging across all the metrics. There's a systematic shortfall of synchronizing or damping torque for certain units under certain conditions. And again, that's heavily driven by the location of synchronous machines. And going back to that situation where if you have high SNSP, you have a certain amount of synchronous machines on still, and it's really about which units are in that small group. It's not always about the size of the group, it's sometimes about the membership of the group. A single isolated unit can drive a lot of problems. In terms of further study for this one, there's a key assumption in the critical clearing times, which was that protection would actually pick up. We modeled that as a simulation events where they were just open at the defined number of cycles. Whereas as the fault level work showed, we're seeing a drop in fault level. So a next stage of this would be assessing, would the protection pick up for all these faults? Because as you can see, we have that scarcity emerging on backup protection. So if we don't get things to pick up immediately, you might start seeing significant problems. Equally, the generated model questions, do they really capture the stresses placed on a synchronous machine when it's only one of 4 or 5 on the system? And they're the two big modeling questions there for me, really. I think I'd like to just pass on to the next speaker now and thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Peter. So system congestion, which is the next dimension of system stability that has been analyzed. It's done for both Continental Europe and Ireland and Northern Ireland power systems. So I'll invite Mihal from NCNR to take us through the work that was done under this head.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this event. I only try to decipher that NCNR stands for National Center for Nuclear Research in Poland. So what I'm going to address today is the issue of the need for managing congestion between market regions, so-called cross-border congestions. This is a kind of a different type of technical scarcity, so it demands a little bit of introduction. If we go to the next slide, I'll try to give it to you. So the first statement could be that the first step of congestion management is in fact the proper allocation of flows. And in reality, allocated flows and the real flows in the systems can be significantly different. Now, there is an important thing. There is no egalitarian approach to different kinds of flows in the reality. Not each of them have the same rights. Let me simplify that. Generally, the market-driven flows are considered to be privileged, and there will be always the room for them in transmission system. But the rest of the flows can fit into thermal capacity or can exceed it, causing the congestions, the network congestions. And if we approach congestions, then we have to go into remedial actions, which are mainly redispatch, using of phase shifting transformers, topology switching, and so on. And we claim that coordinated remedial actions are the most efficient. So now we can ask the most important questions here. In fact, how great is the magnitude of envisaged unscheduled flows? Do we expect some substantial need for cross-border coordination in the future, especially in the context of high penetration of renewables? And would we encounter any technical scarcities in terms of cross-border coordination? And this research was conducted based on the data introduced by PSC Innovation. So there are 3 scenarios divided into 21 snapshots, and the coverage of market simulation is Europe, and the grid simulation covers CEE region. Okay, so going to the next slide, I'll tell you that what we did here was, in fact, trying to estimate the amount of unscheduled flows as the indicator for the need for future remedies. And doing so, we had decompose the physical flow into components. We have identified import-export flows and transit flows. And on top of that, we have also estimated the amount of loop flows. And loop flows, along with the part of allocated flows which were not scheduled, are considered the unscheduled flows. So this is the bottom arrow on our picture here. And what we present, so we have gathered a bunch of data, the enormous amount of data. We are going to present only a tiny fraction of this now. And on the picture below, we can see the selected borders, so the 3 borders marked by different colors, and the numbers given for different 21 snapshots. And what is presented is the amount of unscheduled flows estimated by our method. And what we can see here is a visible correlation between unscheduled flows between, for example, Czech, Austrian, and Czech-Slovakian border. We can see also that they anti-correlate with the flow from Austria to Germany. We can see that the amount of flows is higher in going green scenarios and distributed generation scenarios as compared with the energy transition ones. And going to the last slide, I will give you some broad summary of what has been done. So generally, we have performed this identification, and depending on the scenario, it varies. The amount of unscheduled flows varies from 500 megawatts to even 4,000 megawatts. The reason for such a high values, which are significantly, considerably greater than the one reported from by NSOE in technical reports, is of course a higher penetration of renewables, but also the market modeling method and mapping of the market outcomes into the grid. We can see as the other conclusion that the general direction of unscheduled flows is from north to south. However, we can see also some turning back to Germany, for example, through Austrian-German border. And what we can say is also that we have used the method for identification, which is our flow coloring method. It is totally consistent with the methodology used by NSOE for identification of different kinds of flows. And this is like a prerequisite for the further actions, further research doing within the project, which is aimed at assessing the cost sharing of the remedial actions. This is going to be a topic of next seminars. So if you are interested, please feel invited to take part in seminars of 3.4. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michal. So there was work conducted under system congestion scarcity by Agrid and Sony as well. So I'll just take you through what we have done. So the congestion analysis on the all-island system was carried out again for 2 future scenarios, both intact and N-1 system conditions. One thing to note here is that the congestion context for the all-island system is quite different to the continental system, which you've just heard about. As the all-island system, it is synchronously isolated. So the subject of congestion is within a single synchronous zone. And we have used the thermal overloading on lines within our system as a metric to identify the system congestion. So you can see the graph there, where we can clearly see that as we increase the renewable generation level represented by S and SP, the density as well as the magnitude of line overloads increases significantly towards the right-hand corner of your screen. The red points here indicate summer operating conditions. The blue points indicate winter operating conditions. So the summer shows higher overloads despite reducing load levels, but that happens because there's a seasonal change in the line ratings as well, and that dominates the net effect. These simulations have also showed the impact of renewables connected to 100 kV network and below. Anything above 220 has been identified to be not too much affected, primarily because a lot of the renewable generation are connected at 110 and below. So the line overloads, they occur as increasing renewable energy levels appear far from the load centers. With very little local absorption, the power then has to be transferred across the transmission network with and then subsequently overloads it. You can see that when we go to the higher renewable energy scenario, it just amplifies the effect that much more, just further driving in the point that there is a very strong correlation between congestion occurring in the system and the level of renewable generation that you have within the system. So the key outcomes from this analysis is that there's a clear global scarcity for system congestion for the all-island system, which has been identified. So the wind farm collector networks, which are 110 kV mostly here, they need to be managed going forward. This can be done by in a number of ways. You can have network upgrades, but you can also have some sort of a congestion product to deal with this problem. So I think we have basically concluded all the analysis, apart from there was analysis done on system restoration on the all-island system by Avery and Sony. Due to time limitations, we've not included that in this webinar, but you can find it in the report. There's an entire chapter dedicated to it. So I'll quickly go to the overall conclusions of our webinar today. So as presented in the previous sections, different aspects of system stability in view of increased renewable generation have obviously been analyzed. But due to the varying nature of the systems, for example, Nordic system is characterized by a large amount of hydro generation. Continental system is very strongly interconnected, while the all-island system of Ireland and Northern Ireland is synchronously isolated. The inter-system comparison in terms of just the presence or absence of scarcity, it doesn't really tell you the complete story. So the results for the system stability aspects that we've seen, we've characterized them as follows. So one characterization is an evolving characteristic. So an evolving characteristic means that a trend appears to be developing as the renewable penetration increases, but it's not likely to be a scarcity in the short to medium term. It is an indicator of where things are headed, really. The next category is a concern. So a concern is when a scarcity is not apparent as such, but there is a very strong trend which may develop into a scarcity in the medium term. And then obviously a scarcity is an operational issue which requires mitigation. So bear in mind that when we say a scarcity is emerging, that means that by 2030 that scarcity is emerging. So we can summarize all the results in those categories. So we start with frequency stability. From a frequency stability point of view, inertia is clearly a scarcity for the all-island system, but for the continental system, it is more of a concern. Similarly, frequency containment is an evolving characteristic in all systems, but for the all-island system, it must be noted that the current FFR product, number one, has been included, and we already had a mitigation for the inertia scarcity in place to enable us to run the frequency stability evaluations. So a mitigation in terms of frequency containment has already been applied when running these simulations. And still we end up with an evolving characteristic, especially interestingly, in the low renewable scenario, because in the low renewable scenario, we have a smaller number of fast acting reserves. Steady state reactive power or steady state voltage regulation, it has been shown as a scarcity for both the Ireland and Northern Ireland and continental system. The dynamic reactive injection has come across as a scarcity for the all-island system, but not for the continental European system. Similarly, dynamic voltage regulation, very closely linked to the fault levels. Again, the same trend, dynamic reactive injection scarcity is identified for the all-island system, but not for the continental system. Critical clearing times in both the systems show an evolving characteristic, as you might remember from Peter's slides, that it is becoming an issue for the backup protection, not the front, the initial first line protection. So it is an evolving characteristic that needs to be kept an eye on. Rotor angle margin is not shown to be a scarcity for continental system in these simulations, but it is a localized concern for the all-island system. Oscillation damping has been identified as an emerging problem for both the systems, continental and Ireland and Northern Ireland. System congestion is more of a global concern for for the continental system, as opposed to a transmission capacity scarcity for the island and Northern Ireland system. System restoration has been analyzed only for Ireland and Northern Ireland, and the results showed that it is an evolving characteristic that needs to be kept an eye on. We need a very dynamic sort of a system restoration plan, because some of the self-starting units are being replaced and the target unit locations are being replaced. So the restoration paths are changing. So that's what we have observed. So in summary, we can see here that, you know, the continental system generally appears to be evolving towards scarcities for most system stability categories. They're not scarcities yet. But we can also observe that the all-island system for our Ireland and Northern Ireland is witnessing the renewable generation impacts before the continental system. Now, this is because of the isolated nature of the system, but it's also due to the fact that comparatively higher levels of renewable generation were considered for the all-island system. So just to give you an example, in the most aggressive scenario, which is a low carbon living scenario, around 70% of the annual demand was being met by renewable generation for the all-island system. And that renewable generation was predominantly non-synchronous and intermittent. So keep in mind that it's not a one-to-one apple-to-apple comparison. There's different system characteristics and different renewable levels. The common thing is they're all above 50, but how far above 50 varies. And the all-island system is far above 50 as opposed to the continental system. So the overall key outcomes, right? We've seen multiple scarcities identified for the all-island system. For the continental system, some scarcities and areas of concern are identified, but what has been clearly demonstrated is that there's an evolution of system needs for the all-island system that is occurring. So this is an important point. A lack of clearly evident system scarcity, it does not imply an absence of scarcity altogether. What I mean by that is that whether a scarcity appears or not depends on the choice of focus area. Which in this case for the continental system was Poland. Had we chosen the Iberian Peninsula, the results might be slightly different. It also depends on the snapshot selection, because the analysis was done on selected snapshot. The criteria for snapshot selection, if we change that, we might see some more interesting results. The renewable energy levels, as I discussed, obviously are one thing. And what sort of stimuli have been used to do the analysis. That also plays a big part in whether we see a scarcity or we don't see a scarcity. Whenever we've identified scarcities, they can be mitigated through system services, but they need to be, so it's not just the system services, which brings me back to my initial slide on the rationale of the EU-SysFlex project. A problem has been identified as technical scarcity. You can propose for it, but it has to be underpinned by a well-considered regulatory and economic framework for it to work. And then there should be tools for the system operators to deploy that as well, keeping in view the capabilities of the evolving technologies that are identified as solutions. So another important thing to consider here is that the studies relied on RMS models. Now, the applicability of RMS models at higher renewable levels is unclear. Therefore, we limited our analysis to electromechanical transients and synchronous frequency ranges. The outcomes of this analysis, therefore, should be interpreted in view of this fact. So where we go from here, the outcomes of task 2.4 will subsequently get fed into work package 3, which is focused on system service design, work package 10, which is the delivery of a roadmap, and task 2.6, which is focused on identifying viable mitigations for the scarcities that we've identified through task 2.4. So now I will open the floor for questions, and I will invite Marianne, who's the technical director of the EU-SysFlex project, to ask the panelists the questions on behalf of the audience.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So we have now 10 minutes of time to address some of the questions that you have asked through the Q&A. So we will start with 3 questions about the first scarcity that we have worked on, which is frequency and inertia. So we have first a question addressed to Jocelyn about what are the triggers for the faults and the system splits. So what do you consider to be able to trigger those faults and system splits? And maybe if you can also elaborate on the results about the Iberian Peninsula and why we have such a high rock-off as it has a large hydraulic power plants.
Okay, thank you, Marianne, and thank you for those questions. First of all, about system splits. So we do not simulate the splits, but what could occur in case of a split. So each zone, in case of a separation, would see a power imbalance corresponding to the power flows at its border at the moment of the split. And so we look at what would happen afterwards in terms of frequency indicators in each of the separated zones. After that, the reasons that would explain the split could be diverse. Some events were observed in the past in Europe of system split, and the reasons can be diverse. About the Iberian Peninsula, so we observe very high levels of variable renewables in this zone for several hours of the 2 scenarios, especially the renewable ambition scenario. We have about 90% of variable renewables in the generation. And also the zone has a relatively low interconnections with the rest of the system compared to other zones. So those 2 factors explain why we observe very high rock-off situations in this particular zone.
Thank you very much. Then there is a question about the Nordic system that is addressed to UC. If you could please elaborate on the penetration of renewables and in particular, I guess, variable renewables in the scenarios for the Nordic system, please.
Thank you, Marianne. In the Nordic system, in all scenarios, the penetration of variable renewable energy sources was quite low. So that means less than 20%. I don't remember the exact number. Probably you can find it in the deliverable D2.2 of SysFlex project. But then, of course, the share of hydropower in Nordic countries is very high. So the combined penetration of renewable energy sources was something like 70–80%. But for the exact numbers, you should check D2.2.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you, UC. So UC is referring to a previous report that was delivered that details all the scenarios for the EU-SysFlex project and that you can find on the EU-SysFlex website. Maybe a wider, not really a question, and I believe that it is a solution that will be considered in the next step of work package 2. But maybe Hassan, you could tell us a few words what you think about synchronous condenser and what would be the place to solve the inertia problem.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Marianne, for the question and the person who asked the question. As Marianne just explained, the mitigations for the identified problems are the scope of the next task, which is task 2.4. But it begs the question, yes, it's a very valid question, what sort of mitigations we can have. We can have synchronous condensers definitely as a mechanism for mitigation, but there could be other mitigation mechanisms. For example, we could have a look at the grid forming technology and see whether that can provide solution to the scarcities we have seen. For the inertia scarcity in the current all-island system, what we have a synchronous inertial response product. That product it incentivizes essentially the conventional generators to reduce their min gen. So what happens is that if a conventional generator reduces its minimum generation level, that means that it can be run at that point, and that frees up space for renewable generation to be integrated into the system. So there could be a myriad of solutions, but the approach that the EU-SysFlex project has taken is that any solutions are wrapped under a system service framework, essentially. So as long as that has been well considered and thought out, you could have a number of solutions.
Thank you very much. We need to move on to maybe the voltage scarcity, dynamic and steady state voltage issues. So we have a question about what load models are used for the analysis, and what do you believe would be the impacts of having also in the load increasing share of inverters? So maybe Mateusz, you would like to go first?
Okay. So regarding load models, which have been used for the analysis, I think the description of the load models have been introduced in deliverable from task 2.3, which have provided the detailed description of our model. By now, I'm not able to deliver the detailed description of our model, but I remember that it has been referenced in deliverable 2.3. Probably I would be able to answer this question later in a text version when I will be able to see the model and see the data.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And regarding second question, which was about voltage scarcity, what the model was used, and how will it impact the results if future load are increasingly inverter based. In our analysis, we have assumed that we use an simple load model, not inverter connected one. So I cannot easily predict now how will it impact the results. Probably it would affect the power system operation state regarding voltage stability in some aspects, but I think it requires further investigation.
Thank you very much. Peter, maybe you can complete with the view for the all-island system, please. And also we have another question that is addressed to Peter. It's very interesting conclusion about voltage. It is still widely considered as a local scarcity. So how do you see how you could be dealing with, and can you elaborate a little bit more, sorry, about how you can consider it as a global voltage control issue, please?
Sure. Kind of the philosophy there of when you have so many local problems, it becomes global. I think the best example for me is always, imagine a scenario where you're trying to incentivize people to provide services, where a third party will invest in a service providing solution, and you kind of tell them, these are the scarcities I need to deal with. And then they invest and try and get revenue from some sort of market mechanism. Imagine a scenario where you have a 110 kV scarcity that you identify, and you treat it as purely local, and you incentivize people to deliver you a solution. Then another 110 kV scarcity emerges, so you incentivize a second one. And then eventually down the line, you decide to treat all these local ones as a 220 kV scarcity and incentivize a 220 kV solution. That 220 kV solution will effectively render the 110s obsolete, potentially, which means because of your lack of forward thinking and global planning, you've encouraged people to deliver these small patchwork solutions, which you then, through your own decisions, will render obsolete, which will really, to my mind, hammer sort of investor confidence in services and sort of following the signals you're sending, which could then leave the TSO having to buy assets itself because you've undermined confidence. I think that's how I view that, these many local becoming a global problem. If that sort of answers the question there, hopefully.
Thank you, yeah. And finally, because we're close to the end of this webinar, just a couple of questions about rotor angle stability. So first, a question addressed to Mateusz about the maximum instantaneous rate of res that has been considered for Poland for the dynamic simulations, please.
Okay, so regarding that question, the detailed information about renewable capacity installed in our models, and also synchronous capacity and load, also load demand, is included in the Annex 2 of deliverable 2.4. So is chapter number 11. Also, I would give the brief description in the texts with the precise values. As far as I'm concerned, we have observed approximately 60% of system non-synchronous to synchronous penetration index in some of the snapshots. So the maximum observed value within our analysis is approximately 60% of the proportion between non-synchronous and synchronous generation.
Thank you.
SNSP is the complex index, so it also includes the load demand. So it's not the clear proportion between the generation, but the maximum observed SNSP is 60%.
Thank you very much. And maybe the last question to close this session is, because it leads also to what solutions we are now considering in the project and in our own countries. It is addressed, I think, to either Peter or Hassan. Is EirGrid considering a service on an ancillary service to dampen the oscillations and for, to solve this this issue?
I suppose we've seen this issue through the broader body of work going to analysis will be that, and say that we are or aren't considering it, but we can consider it if it comes up as an actual genuine problem in our more detailed subsequent internal sort of study. But regardless of whether a solution is considered, whether we introduce a service, it definitely seems to be a problem, and there will have to be some mitigation measure applied for it.
Thank you very much. And now to everyone. So I would first like to thank very much the speakers for all the work that they have provided, very interesting work. So all the complete results are available in the deliverable, which is public and is available as well as the video of the recording, sorry, of this webinar on the EU-SysFlex website. So if you want to have more information about the models, the analysis that have been carried on, you can find this information in the reports. Additionally, as some of the speakers have indicated, you can also address other questions by email if you want some information, if you request some information from our experts. And finally, I would like to thank you all very much to have attended this first webinar. And I would like to invite you to our next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks' time on the 26th, and will be dedicated to the financial impacts of RES penetration in the power system. So thank you very much, everyone. And this webinar is now over. Thank you.